Hey class, it's China time. We're going to finish up the China from 1921 to the present that we were talking about in class today. I'm going to start at the earliest point that one of your colleagues was at, and that's the consequences of the Cultural Revolution. Look, if you go out and kill the teachers and eliminate the doctors and re-educate all of these people out in the countryside, one of the consequences of that is you're not going to have anybody learning how to, for example, read and write. So there was one of the consequences of the Cultural Revolution was a generation of illiteracy. There's also an establishment of this cult of personality of Mao Zedong. This was a focused effort on his part amongst these Red Guards, to generate the same kind of adoration that one might give to a religion for the man. 36 million, primarily well-educated Chinese were, quote, re-educated. This could be everything from regular beatings to being upended from your home and dragged out to the countryside and re-educated by becoming a farmer, even if you were a doctor or a teacher or a lawyer or whatever. So this is a pretty dramatic, traumatic event. 500,000 dead. And the Cultural Revolution really only ended with Mao Zedong's death in 1976. Today, the Chinese government views this as a largely negative event in Chinese history. So that's something to keep in mind too. As we approach the present, with Mao Zedong's death, there was a power struggle in China, and out of the scrum emerges Deng Xiaoping. And Deng's big contribution to the story of China is the creation of these special economic zones. These are regions a lot of them along the coast, the East Coast, the Pacific Coast, that maintain relatively few state regulations. And all of this was to encourage foreign investment in these regions, in these cities that dotted the coast. And what's fascinating is that they were essentially a free enterprise zone to allow for capitalism to flourish. And people got jobs, and people had an outlet. Chinese had an outlet for their creative efforts. Now, what was interesting was that they also experimented with limited political freedom as well. And one of the truisms, I suppose, is the idea that a free enterprise system only works when you also have political freedom. The two go hand in hand, political freedom with economic freedom. And that's kind of what helps China take off in the 80s and 90s. So what's the result? Well, the country of China, the People's Republic of China, GDP has grown over 1,000% since 1978. It's the largest GDP in the world, surpassing the United States back, I believe, in 2014. It's the world's #1 exporter, and it's a really dramatic turnaround. And again, most people figure, hey, China's always going to be growing. Now it's starting to slow down a little bit. It's going through some recessionary periods. There's all sorts of issues today with whether or not China is going to continue at the torrid pace that it was growing. It was growing in double digits. The GDP was growing in double digits. It's cooling off to about 6.5%. Still insane amounts of growth relative to America, which is anemic at 2% at best. Both of the links here I encourage you to go to. They are to the Central Intelligence Agency, the CIA's World Factbook, which is a great source of information on any country in the planet, It's a treasure trove. I highly recommend you use that for future research projects. Now, the GDP, the gross domestic product, the sum total of all the value, the sum total of the value of all goods and services produced by the economy of a particular country, may be the largest in the world, but the population is also the world's largest too. So if you take a per capita look, a per person look at the GDP, it tells a different story. I mean, the Chinese per capita income is about $8,000, a little more. America's is, geez, north of I want to say 40,000, 42,000. So the per capita income, the country's people are much more wealthy in America than China. But because there's so many people in China, when you take a look at per capita GDP, it certainly slices the pie a little bit thinner. Again, one more fact about China's economy today. It's about half the population, about 55% of the population is urban or suburban, about 45% is rural. China's a big country. What you do with this relatively large rural population is still kind of up in the air. You obviously still need farmers to farm, but 45% of your population, when your country's population is around 1.4 billion people, is a big number. And you want them to be employed in some arena that maximizes their potential. Farming's important, but it's not helping drive an industrialized economy forward. One other big issue that occurred in China's recent history is the Tiananmen Square rallies. Basically what happens is hundreds of thousands of college students descend on Beijing outside the Forbidden Palace. We talked about the Forbidden Palace back when we were talking about the Ming Dynasty. And democratic reformers start coming out, and the protests center on human rights violations of the government, the general lack of political freedom in China, and demands for political liberalization. Now, for a couple weeks there, it was pretty heady times in 1989. You got to remember that the Berlin Wall had just fallen, and there's, the Soviet Union is tottering on some sort of precipice. People are pretty excited when Tiananmen Square breaks out and it looks like communism is in retreat. Well, the Chinese government cracks down on the protesters. You may have, I encourage you to click on every one of these links. They take you to YouTube in the moment, at the time events. In Tiananmen Square, one of the most famous moments was this guy crossing the street as a line of tanks is coming down to help crush this rebellion. And he stands in front of the tanks, just one man. And it seems that nobody really knows who this guy is. It seems to be just this act of defiance that really was pretty breathtaking to behold on TV, live TV. And well, there was an attempt to rally the support of the people to the side of the protesters, which failed. You don't control state media. That's problematic. The government began making threats against the protesters, and they ordered the troops in. The troops wouldn't fire on the students, so following a purge of the ruling committee in Beijing, the leaders sympathetic to the protesters were ousted. They pulled troops from different parts of China, shipped them into Beijing, so they had no affiliations with the kids in Beijing, and they crushed the protests. This lower picture gives you some idea of what the mayhem looked like. A nationwide crackdown on political liberalization followed, and this flirtation with democratic liberalization was crushed. Now, last little bit I want to talk with you about is the demographics of China. one of the big challenges facing China is their growth rate. And from 1979 to about 2011, China had in place what they refer to as a one-child policy. For the vast majority of people living in China, they were only allowed one child. Now, consider if you're living on a farm, it's pretty tough to get by with one child. And if you're going to have a child, of course, what sex are you going to want but a male? Because they can do more work around the farm. Now, for this roughly 30-year period, about 400 million births were, quote, prevented. Prevention includes contraceptives, of course, enforced abortions, female infanticide, killing female babies and then trying again for a male, and of course offering up girls for adoption so that you could take another try at getting a male. Now, the practical result of this policy for 30 plus years was a overabundance of males. Right now, in marrying age, there's about 117 males to every 100 females of marriable age in China. The normal is about 103 to 107. So they've got 10%, 15% too many males. The other issue is that you have an aging population, and you don't have quite enough young Chinese to support all the old ones, as this demographic chart shows you. If everything's hunky-dory, these bar graphs should be equal. Then you have roughly the same number of males and females as you go through each age bracket. Take a look what happens in the 20s, 30s, and teens. There's a lot more males than females. And now it doesn't look like a big difference, but here you have 60 million people, males between 25 and 29. Here you have, or excuse me, almost 70 million. Here you have about 65 million here. 5 million, not a big deal, but you keep adding up these numbers and it comes out to about 15% more males than females. So you not only have a very frustrated group of males that can't find a wife, you also have other impacts from that. So, for example, people want to get married, they are going to import brides. Well, North Korea has an abundance of people who are starving. It's a failed, well, it's not failed, but it's a suffering society. And there's been any number of articles in Western press about essentially North Korean women crossing the border or being purchased as Chinese wives. And the problem is that the Chinese look down on the Koreans, and these women are becoming abused. Sex slavery is a problem, all being driven by this state policy. Now, they've restricted the policy. They're encouraging people to have more kids, but because of these demographic issues. But it was the social experimentation, 400 million. That's larger than the population of America of abortions or prevented births. Now, we'll talk about the impacts of that tomorrow. I'm interested in what you guys think. I'll see you tomorrow. Have a wonderful rest of the evening. Bye-bye.